challenges that we never dreamed about.
If you wanna go there, that will pick you up. Look at my thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You been okay?
Is that just the new proposed?
I'm almost kind of happy to get back to the place.
Oh, you got
Next week, it's all like.
Archie, happy to
Well, we do. Please do that. So this is the existing.
That's what we have to think. Why maybe doing this one? I'm good, Larry, how you doing? It's got a handout this morning. Is this the old one? That's the old one.
Alright.
Van old.
You doing alright?
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
That's good. It's just such a, it's an interesting experience. It's sort of a very joyous, this got a shot, but it's a very, almost
It's such
really
a.
celebratory, kind of everybody's like, hey, of course, I did run into a few people that I knew.
Yeah,
Not
I don't know,
quite.
I didn't realize the tension that was building,
Yeah.
for a year or more until then, and it was like, oh,
Yeah, really, it's like the same with me. Well, Susan is getting one tomorrow.
awesome.
Yeah. If I could, let me call this special call meeting to order. And good morning, everybody. And I guess the best thing to do is just to start with the proposed rewrite. And Ron or Anna, who is gonna,
We put in about a minute and then Anna's done all the heavy lifting, so it's hers.
okay,
But we started off with this, with a couple of things we needed to update, sort of inspired by having a standard procedure to replace fill vacancies. And then the board acted, said, let's just look at it all, because it's all pretty old and archaic and mixed. And my thought was that we would look at it, take out the archaic, see what the statute does that we don't need in the charter, and see if there's anything we want to do, we need to put in the charter, because there'll be difference in statute. Then I handed it to Anna, and she's done all those things, and she'll be the one to go through the presentation of questions on it. And as some of you have met Anna, some of you don't, Anna worked with me for 15 years as a paralegal, decided to go for the big bucks and went to law school, came back to find out the paralegals were making all the money.
So the town charter, as I guess you all know, had not been substantially updated since the 50s, and the law has changed a bit since then. So there were several things in the existing charter that probably make sense to update, paragraphs that should just go away altogether. And it was easier to just start fresh than to try to redline the existing charter for you all. So the sections have been renumbered so that they match the articles that they're in. There are some things like duties of the town accountant or town treasurer, which doesn't exist anymore. Those have gone away. And by and large, your charter should be very, very simple and straightforward. It's the hardest governing document for the town to change. And so most things that you want to make changes to as you go along should be in your ordinances. There are a couple of things that some other cities and towns in North Carolina do in their charters that you all don't. And we can certainly talk about those if there are things that you want to change. Or add. Lots of cities allow for recall elections, which is an election that you would make in your charter. Some cities allow for the assessment of special assessments for roads and sidewalks, things like that. But for the most part, this is updated based on Ron's notes on what you all wanted to do. Updating the filling of vacancies, kind of cleaning up the council manager plan of government section so that it matches the language in the statute. And if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to do that, or we can run through it section by section, whatever you'd prefer.
You know, I might suggest that we do that. This is a pretty, pretty significant thing we're doing as far as, it's not something that's going to be done in every 5 years or something like that. And some of these sections we won't spend much time on, but if you can just kind of spin us through them and see what questions might come up, does that sound good to everybody? Yeah. So, and it also might be good for the public, anybody listening,
Sure.
Thank you.
And maybe helpful just for a process overview, this does need to go to the legislature, be filed probably by a member of the local delegation. Will be helpful if all of the members of the local delegation are willing to sign on to introduce it. And I believe that they have a filing deadline or bill request deadline that will come up in late April. I'll double check that deadline. So I don't know if you all are planning to try and introduce this in this session, but if you are, just have in mind that there are some pretty rapid deadlines coming up for those local bill filing.
Sounds like if we were planning on doing that, this is the end of February, do you think a deadline of end of March would be?
I think that's probably
Good.
doable. I'll double check.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds great.
So the first section is just the official incorporation that says Black Mountain can exist and all of the have all of the powers available to local governments. The section 1.2 is another just kind of blanket statement that the town is vested with those powers that will be exercised by the mayor, by the town council instead of a board of aldermen, and the town manager. The corporate limits will be those that exist at the time the charter is adopted. So many annexations that doing a meets and bounds description at this point probably more messy than it's justified. Article 2 is all of the information about the town council, formerly Board of Aldermen. 5 members with a mayor and a vice mayor. The paragraph B is the specifics about nonpartisan elections. That language is all lifted from the statute, mimics what the statute provides for having a nonpartisan primary followed by a general election. There are 3 methods of local elections that you can choose from. One, of course, is partisan elections. One is nonpartisan without the primary. The other is partisan with a primary, which is how you all have done it for a while. Paragraph C, the terms of office. 4-year terms, staggered, provided that those will be staggered in accordance with the session law that was adopted year before. Filling of vacancies. Provides that the town council will fill any vacancy that occurs. If that vacancy occurs more than 135 days before the next election, then that seat will be on the ballot for the election in that year. And whoever you have appointed to fill the vacancy would only serve until that newly elected member is seated. Otherwise, that the person you appoint would fill the vacancy for the remainder of the term.
And for the public, that is one of the crux of what motivated the council to look at the charter. And so the difference, just to make sure the public understands, I'm sure the council does, and help me if I'm wrong, but before the charter, the old charter that's before us just says you replace whoever it is, you replace it, and that's it. So then you go to the general statutes that had the 90-day, the same operation, but it was 90 days versus now we're at 135. And the purpose there, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the purpose there is to provide, otherwise it kind of doesn't work. And it actually didn't work with 90 because you don't have time to file if it was 91 days, you didn't, no one was notified, if we use no one could file for office, no one could file to run, because the filing period is somewhere like the first 2 weeks of July. And so, am I right? That's the gist of it. We were going under the statutes, which was 90 days, versus now we've stretched it out so that it operates properly and somebody can, if they can file to run for that seat if they wish to.
Yes.
That was the point of changing. Probably the only difference between your charter provision now and the statute, which is different, is 135 days, as the mayor says, so that we do have that vacancy. People have time to file. To run for. Right. I wonder where the 90 days even came from, because that's just a. It's probably archaic in itself. It's probably written when there was a later filing period. Right.
I do have a question about that 90 days, or the 135 days. It's just for us to discuss, since we kind of came to that, with some mental math. I did look it up, and just in this year, 2020, there was about 120 days from the first filing day till election day, and 110 after the filing period was closed. So I just want to make sure that we all think that 135 is the appropriate amount. That would give 25 days for someone to decide that they want to run. Do we think that's too much, or the appropriate amount? Or anyone have an opinion on that?
But I think it's kind of hard to take it closer to election day. So you can, the other direction, it's, is different. I don't know the merit of going too far out.
Right. No, I don't think we should go further. I just want, since we had those numbers, since we didn't really have those numbers before, I just want to make sure
It was worth bringing up because it's kind of the gist of, besides cleaning up the stuff that kind of probably didn't even apply anymore. This is really, I think, council's motive in making the change. So just make sure you understand it. But I think what the public should understand, anybody who cares to, is that this change is, it's really operational, really more than, it didn't really change the way the statute operated anymore, other than it makes it more practical in my thinking. The one difference we did run into is the difference between the statute and the ordinance. They were different, but they both, under the law, at least under the interpretation of the School of Government, had equal weight. And so the board could choose, when you're appointing somebody, under the statute, if you appointed them more than 90 days out, it would be to the next election. But under the charter, it didn't say that. And the School of Government's opinion was, since we could just go to the charter and pick whenever we appointed somebody. Of course, that means things could change from vacancy to vacancy. So we wanted a uniform vacancy, and then, as Doug pointed out, we didn't have enough time for people to run for that office. We do have a vacancy. So let me ask a question. What a scenario question, which obviously no one would ever hope it transpires, but you lose 4 members. They're all in the same place, and the 5th member runs over them all out in the parking lot. Anyway, you lose, in the odd case, you lose just a tragic number of officials. So how would that work? You wouldn't have enough people for a board.
The statute has a kind of fail-safe provision for a minority of board members to come together to make those appointments.
Right.
And I believe that there's a requirement for an election following that kind of situation. In fact, there is a provision that provides the process by which a group of citizens in town can come together and constitute a new board if all of the members of the board. Right.
I was sort of curious. Did y'all, did you get one of these? Did somebody mail one of these to you?
I borrowed, Savannah.
I hadn't looked at mine in a while, but a few days back I pulled it open, and I think it contains that. It mentions that operation there somewhere, and I think it does mention the thing about the sit. If you just had everybody's gone.
Right.
Sit a group of citizens who just get together and do it.
Yeah.
So the one that we were mailed, or with the agenda, that language was from the previous term.
That's the new one.
That's
So
the new
it's
line.
real clear in that one about the governor fills the vacancies if there's an emergency situation.
And again, I'm not sure what you're looking at, but the statutes have changed over time on that too. We've tried to get the governor out of it and keep it local, which is really unusual in our current climate.
That language is what is lifted from the current statute, that in the event there's not a majority of this board remaining, the members who are remaining can fill those vacancies, but they have to be made by the appointment of the governor if there is not a quorum of this board.
All right. Any other questions on section 2.2?
So I'll just say, to be clear, I guess with the public, that my intent with this change, what I was shooting for, and I think we've got it, is if somebody's appointed, their term only lasts until the next election or until the remainder of that term is done.
Well, nothing changed. I mean, the statute did that.
Excuse me?
The statute did that. It's the time period.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but, well, I don't mean to pick on Tim, but that's not what happened there, so that's what I wanted to get it into.
So how did it work differently with Tim? He was,
This conforms charter with statute.
right.
Our charter essentially just said that the board would fill the vacancy. And the interpretation of that lack of language following the charter was this board could either follow the statute and say, we appoint you to fill it to the next election, or we appoint you to fill the rest of the term. And the charter and the statute differ on that. Now the charter and the statute will be the same,
Exactly.
except for that 135.
That's what I wanted.
That's a good clarification.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Tim's got the
sorry.
whole 4 years, and I'm saying I want any new appointments would only get until the next election or until their seat expired,
Right.
whichever came first.
Right.
And that's what this accomplishes. So that's what I wanted to be clear for everybody in my head what's going on.
Josh, I actually don't know what this section 4 is from.
This was emailed to us from, I think, Attorney Sneed earlier on before.
Before this current draft, okay.
Yes.
Because I think this has been split up into a couple of different
Yeah.
provisions
Oh,
in
gotcha.
here. So
Okay.
it doesn't all read exactly this way.
Yeah, what
Sorry
we
for that confusion. I was like, some of that language looks familiar and some of it does not.
I think what you could think about is what you have before us here that Anna's going through. That's what you're considering voting on
Right.
when you get it the way you want it.
So one other point, that I understand that the process for filling vacancies wouldn't be included in a charter. I mean, the actual procedure. But I just I want to remind everybody that that's a conversation we need to continue having after this charter after we're finished with this, that how we fill any vacancies is important too.
Takes 3 votes, doesn't it?
It takes 3 votes, but I think, we may stick with the same procedure.
Yeah.
I don't know, I just
Yeah.
think it's an important conversation
Right.
to have.
It is.
There are several municipalities in the state that do it in very different ways. You may have seen some coverage in the news recently of a vacancy on the Charlotte City Council where they opened it up to applications from the public and received somewhere in the neighborhood of 450 applications for that vacant seat. And the council went through them all and chose from those applications. I think that's probably the super minority way of doing that by different jurisdictions. But you're right, there are lots of different ways to do that, including whether there's a particular notice period or public input period or applications that get filed. And we can certainly continue talking about that.
And the same is true of the board, all the boards that report to the Board of Aldermen. And I know we're going to have some vacancies, I don't know when the next ones come out, June or something. So it's not something we want to delay the conversation on.
Section 2.2. Go right ahead, Anna.
Oh, that is this filling of vacancies provision.
No, I'm sorry. I was just curious if the board had any more questions on 2.2.
Mhm.
But if not, I guess we're ready to go along if there's no more questions for you.
Section 2.3 is very similar to language that existed in the current charter, which just provides that if you all vote for a pay increase, you don't get to benefit from it. The next board will. Meetings of the town council, the same language is here, except that we have updated that the first meeting following the election is held in December. Your current charter says June. I think the elections used to be in May, way back when.
So let me ask you a question there, Anna. At 7 o'clock, our regular meetings are at
After.
6.
Josh pointed that out to me,
Yeah.
and I needed to change that.
I didn't know if it really made any difference, but
It does, and we'll correct that. Any other questions on that section? Section 2.5, the mayor will preside at the meetings, have the powers conferred by law, and you will elect a vice mayor who will act as mayor pro tem in the absence of the mayor.
this little book, it drew the distinction that if the mayor couldn't serve, that, I think it said this, that some of those executive functions of mayor, and this may be a general statute thing, and you may know it off the top of your head, but don't carry over, that the board has to execute some of those executive functions.
That's part of the reason this is in the charter. We have always had a vice mayor, and this has been conformed to our practice. And you're right, the statute might take us down a different road, so this is something that's important that it be in the charter.
But if the mayor can't serve, and there's a state of emergency, can
Under our charter, the vice mayor can act.
he has the executive functions? That's what I was unclear of with this little book. Yeah, okay.
Section 2.6, you all will determine your own rules and order of business and keep a record of your meetings. Section 2.7 defines a quorum and provides that a quorum is necessary for you all to do business. Section 2.8 provides the rules for adoption of ordinances and resolutions. They have to be introduced in writing to the board for consideration. Have to have a clear title defining what they are. If you adopt an ordinance making an appropriation, it has to only contain appropriations. You can't tack on other policy issues to those. Some effective date language. There's a distinction between ordinances that levy taxes, do some other things. And then after an ordinance is adopted, it needs to be published and posted for the public. Article 3 is adoption of the council manager plan of government, which we currently have, which means that you all appoint a town manager who gets to oversee all of the administrative functions in town. This section's been updated to match the language in the ordinance, in the general statutes, and this is true throughout the charter, to make all of the language gender neutral. There were an awful lot of he's in there.
There were back then.
So the town manager has the authority to hire and fire, oversee departments, must attend all of your meetings, ensure that all of the laws, the charter, the ordinances, regulations are being faithfully executed, prepare and submit a budget to you all. Also make an annual report about town finances for you all and the public. We also allow the manager to designate, and Ron, help me with what we call that, assistant manager.
Assistant town manager.
I think that the statute uses a different phrase, which is fine.
Let me ask a question just for curiosity's sake, and the public might be interested in it. But when the town adopted the council manager form of government, whenever that was. Was that the early 60s or something?
No, that was like 86 or something.
In the 80s.
Mhm.
Is that something that happens under the general statutes that says this is what a town manager in North Carolina has authority to do?
Yes, yes. And this language, numbers 1 through 8, is lifted almost verbatim from the statute
Yeah.
with the powers of the manager.
Right.
The appointment of the assistant manager in the event that the town manager is unable to perform the duties of the office because of absence or disability, the council retains the authority to revoke that designation and appoint someone else. Important to note that the person you appoint can't be a member of the council. Section 3.2, departments and department heads. You all will establish and designate the departments, and you can at any time restructure, rename, abolish, create new departments. And then the head of those departments under the council manager form of government is appointed by the town manager. The council is required to approve, this is section 3.3, the pay schedule and expense allowances. This section has also been updated to match language in the statute that allows you all to opt your employees into state retirement plans, provide health care plans, provide reimbursement for travel expenses. A lot of those things were not provided in the current charter. So making clear here that you are doing some of those things, have the authority to. Section 3.4, you are required by law to have a town clerk that is selected by the town manager. This specifies the couple of duties that the town clerk must do, although, as we all know, the town clerk has lots and lots of other duties to keep up with. Section 3.5, you are also required to have a town attorney. The town attorney serves at the pleasure of the council. It's one of the only positions that's not directly appointed by the town manager. This section is also, the language has been updated just to pare it down just a little bit. It was a little bit verbose in the current version.
Excuse me, I have a quick question about those last two. If there's a vacancy in the town clerk position or the attorney position, it doesn't look like there's any rules around how long it would take to fill those or something like that. Is there any process around, making sure that someone comes in?
The town clerk is hired by the manager.
I think you just have to act in a reasonably diligent fashion to get someone appointed, because you are required by law to have both of those positions. And so if there was an extended vacancy in either the position of the town clerk or town attorney, and a member of the public felt like you weren't acting diligently to make that appointment, then you open yourself up to some liability for that. But I don't think there's a requirement that we cabin that to a particular period of time. And I actually probably would recommend not doing that, because
At least not in your charter.
right.
Okay.
You don't want to get yourself in a position where the charter says you have to do it within 30 days and you can't find a qualified candidate, and then you're in violation of your charter because you couldn't get somebody appointed.
Okay.
Section 3.6, any town employee that, I'm sorry, we use the language that's here. Officers and employees have to give performance bonds for their duties in amounts that the council determines are adequate to protect them from loss. And the premiums are paid by the town. Usually that's limited to anyone who's handling town money. We have not put a particular definition in here because I think you probably want to be able to exempt the kid at the pool who's accepting $2 entry fees. But you should define which town employees are required to give bond, and you can do that in the ordinance.
So who would that be now? Do you know?
I'm thinking I am bonded, the finance officer is bonded, and I don't know that anybody else is.
What's the amount of the bond?
I'll have to look later.
It's okay, I'm just sort of curious, but it's just part of our insurance
I'll
package.
get back to you on that.
Yeah, no, that's not something you'd know off the top of your head necessarily, but I'm just curious.
Probably helpful to, I mean, while we're talking about all these things, to know what the list is of those folks who are carrying a bond and the amount of the bond. And Josh, whether you think there's anybody else who's handling large sums of money on a regular basis, that should potentially be bonded.
Okay.
Section 3.7, much like the administrative departments, you all as the town council can create, rename, restructure, and abolish town boards and commissions. You are required by statute to have a board of adjustment or planning board that can carry out quasi judicial functions. I think I said that right. I'm quickly reading up on the newly rewritten Chapter 160D, which is all of the revised land use codes for North Carolina. And so forgive me if I misspeak on one or two of the land use issues while I'm getting myself caught up.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a public comment that I should probably read at this juncture, because it relates to boards and commissions. This is from Sean Sloan. It says, "It's my understanding that there is no state statute requiring disclosure of conflicts of interest by advisory boards and elected bodies. This does not promote transparency in governance nor serve the interests of our town. For example, the former mayor was not required to disclose that he owned 8 acres adjacent to the town property when it was considering a lease to the daycare, despite the fact that the development would have increased the value of his property substantially. I believe there are some similar questions relating to conflicts of interest in those serving on the planning board. Can the town charter include a requirement that all serving on boards and commissions disclose potential or perceived conflicts of interest?"
My thought on that is because right at the moment with 160D, we get a new set of standards on conflicts of interest. I wouldn't want to put something in the charter that would make you go to the legislature as rules change. But this board could take that up as a matter of ordinance or policy to establish what has to be disclosed.
I mean, that would be my thought, is that it would be better to do it as ordinance.
I think so.
It's also, there are requirements in the state statutes about what constitutes a direct financial interest, and so a conflict of interest. And by statute, that has to be very direct. Something like Mr. Sloan, I think you said, is pointing out, where just the adjacent property might increase in value is not enough to count as a conflict of interest. It would have to be that board member or mayor or planning board member was directly involved in a business relationship with the person who's bringing something before them, or has a family member who is. It's not enough that they may receive some speculative financial benefit.
And that's kind of the way it is now, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's right.
It's immediate family member, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
You find it in the household.
It's very narrow.
It's enlarged a little because prior to 160D, it was just you. Now, if your wife has a
Right.
financial
Right.
interest or your
Exactly.
mother, then it expands that a little bit.
A little bit off the point, but 160D also changed the conflict rules a bit for the MPO. They're a little different than they are for municipality. Is it local government? Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think members of the MPO and this council are required to file statements of economic interest with the Ethics Commission.
Council does.
Council doesn't.
Yeah.
But the MPO does.
MPO does, yeah.
I can take a look and see what exactly our ordinances provide about recusal and conflicts of interest. I don't have that memorized. And we can talk about whether you all think that needs
Well, for
beefing up
those
in
of
some
us
way.
that, the town clerk graciously reminded me to do a renewal on the 2-hour ethics class. And it reminds you that there's not too many things that come up that give you a reason not to vote.
Right.
Hardly any.
Hardly any.
Pretty tough to get there.
I do think it would be good for us and the public to go through the ordinance that we do currently have, and obviously not today, but at some point in the future,
Sure.
and make sure that we feel comfortable with that.
And as we were talking about, that's gonna be a changing thing between now and June when we update all the ordinances to fit with my 60D. So you'll have some stronger language in your new ordinance anyway than you might have had in the old ordinance.
Maybe that's something just worth, and Savannah, getting on, making a note for, I don't know, September, October, whatever it may be, to give our town attorneys time to, to pull it together and with the new statutes, but to put it on the agenda just to take a look at that at one of our regular meetings, later in the year. What's a good time for you two, maybe?
Well, I hate to put ourselves on a short deadline, but compliance and conformity with 160D has to be in place by July 1st. And so a good part of that will be addressed earlier than September.
Yes.
We may be tweaking it later, but you'll be seeing new language before then anyway, and an opportunity to amend it.
So,
Or update it.
would July be okay then, since you have to have it in place? I mean, if it's like you said, you can tweak it later, but I don't.
Jessica is supposed to have the draft ordinance to me by the end of this week, and I believe is planning to bring that new land use code to the planning board at their March meeting. And so I think it probably makes sense for you all to have this discussion in the April meeting even, so that if you want something different than what's in that current draft, we can incorporate those changes before we bring the whole new chapter to you for adoption in June.
In June. All right. That works for
April
y'all.
meeting.
They've sort of built a month buffer in there, as you hear the timeline, it looks like May, but you know how that works.
Yeah. But you all could have this conversation. I think certainly we'll have the draft language about conflicts of interest by then. We can talk through how that compares to the current ordinance and what the state statutes require, and just have a conversation about that so that we're ready to incorporate your preferences into that draft new code before we bring it to you.
It strikes me, if it sounds good to council, that we might just want to have a 8:30 special call meeting to address that. It sounds like it might require some focus and time that might crowd out a regular meeting.
For
And so
consideration of the full land use code rewrite.
what we need what you're preparing us to vote on. Changes.
Might be more than one, but that's
Might be more
probably a
than
good
one, but
idea.
maybe we should start. How about I might suggest this, because you guys don't have to decide now, but think about how you might want to educate the board on it, and we'll just start holding a series of workshops, and that way we can hit on it like at an hour at a time. And sounds like a pretty substantial project and something that we do want to be thorough about anyway, because it's just such a big change. Well, how does that sound to council? And how's that sound to you all? I mean, it's a little more of a bite-sized way to go about it. And if it takes two meetings, if it takes 3 special call meetings, it'll still be a little bit easier for us to work through. That's a lot of detailed changes, I believe.
I will know more when I have the first draft from Jessica.
Yeah.
From the planning director. So can I just get with Josh and talk through that once I've got the,
That sounds good to me, council. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yeah.
But instead of working on it for a regular meeting, we'll vote on it at a regular meeting, but our working through the thing, let's just maybe work through these workshop meetings at 8:30 in the morning. That seems to work well for everybody.
okay. I think we are at section 3.9, which is rules governing town finances. You all need to have rules and regulations governing the receipt and handling of money by the town, which I believe we do have lots of. And then once a year, you are required to have an independent audit of all of the town's finances, which happens every year. And I believe the statute provides that the same auditor can't do that more than a few years in a row. Some specific rules about that. Article 4 is the oath of office that is required by the statute. That oath is in the Constitution. And the final, everyone's favorite, severability. If something in here isn't right, the rest of it doesn't just magically go away. We get to keep being a town, even if one of these provisions is somehow found
It's good
not
news,
to
isn't it?
be.
Great. Any questions for Anna?
As you work through this, did anything jump out as odd or unusual that we should consider?
No, we've kept the charter very straightforward and short. I did look at town charters, as I said, for some other municipalities in North Carolina. Some of them are very detailed. I think, Chapel Hill's town charter is 25 pages and includes all of the information about what their planning board is and what kinds of things it can consider. I think it's probably right to keep this much shorter and more streamlined in case those things change in the future. It might be another 40 years before you tackle this project again. And so not tying yourself down in the charter to some of those things, I think, is the right approach. I do think that it is, whether you all want to include recall elections or the ability to levy special assessments in the future is worth a discussion. Like I said, you're probably not going to update this charter for a long time. And so although you don't currently levy any special assessments, whether 4 years from now, the growth in Black Mountain and the needs of local infrastructure make it feel like you should, you may want that ability.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in order to do special assessments, we have to have that in our charter
Either that or
or a local bill?
separate local bill, correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So, and again, maybe we need to follow up on this, but can you make a special assessment? Let's say sidewalks. We're getting ready, stormwater would be one, but we're getting ready because of the way the statutes are to probably set up a utility. And with stormwater, and because we're gonna just have to, just about, you don't really have much of a choice about it. We have to fund it somehow or another. So, but others, the special assessment, we're creating a utility, which we have the statutory
I think
authority
it's
to
separate
do so.
statutory authority, correct.
But an assessment, we do not.
I think you have to have either a local bill that specifically authorizes you to do it or have it approved in your charter.
Yeah. So, and is
I'll
that,
check that.
I wonder what sort of limit, what comes to mind are infrastructure things, sidewalks and so forth. Because our other, water, and now in all likelihood, the council approves it, in our budget, we'll have a utility for stormwater. And I'm just trying to think of the various reasons, and you may not even know them now, because 10 years from now, it could be something we're not even aware of that you might want to do a special assessment for. But I would be inclined to think that we might want to think about some wording on that, just because otherwise, it just may be an appropriate thing to do while we're looking at this. So I'd like to maybe I'll work on some wording on that, and let's just look at it. Also hear from the public, but it is not something anybody would take lightly. But while we're amending the charter, it may be prudent to make that. I'm trying to think of the downside.
Well, I think up to this point, you've been able to do that with just your regular annual property tax levy.
That's right.
Without any separate assessment for roads or sidewalks.
Right.
Um,
I think that would be, and I'd be curious what, as we ponder that. I mean, that's your point is well taken, and that's what it occurs to me as well, that the pressure that if you, and I'm actually not suggesting, I'm not interested in special assessments. I think it is a way of avoiding a tax increase. It's not as transparent, if you will. Just saying, we need more money to do what we think is important, and we're going to raise taxes.
Special assessments are usually envisioned as being a way of putting the burden where the benefit's going to be.
Right.
Anna can address this better than I can. As you also know, she had a couple of years' experience working in the legislature. But if we add special assessments, I know we'll have to identify them. We can't just put a broad spectrum in there and say we get to do special assessments,
Right.
period. But I'm afraid if we want to get this through fairly quietly,
Uh-huh.
this may not be the legislature to put in power, give the city more powers.
Well, I may revert, take back what I said, that we might want to consider it, because I actually think I would probably lean on your thought on it, that if you need something, if you need more money for sidewalks, then that's a reason that you might say we need a penny, going to raise the taxes a penny because we think sidewalks are that important and it's out there and it's a little easier to deal with. I think some of our municipalities here in the county, if I think I'm reading the paper correctly, I'm not quite sure if I ever am, but if you have the ability to do that, it gets very muddled as to exactly, I'm not sure I think it's that transparent a way to do business, really. Just being clear about what you need the money for, being clear about it, and then if the political will is there, you have a reason to raise taxes if that's what council thinks is important and the priorities are appropriate. So I'll take back that.
Well, you
Take
could,
my-
you
take
could
that back.
always, if, let's say our central business district decided they wanted extra services,
Right.
whether that be, better benches, better, whatever they want.
A police officer, let's do this, police officer to do nothing but to be downtown and walk around and
I mean,
be
if,
present.
if you had the majority of folks that wanted something extra, we could always put that together and then get a local bill for that. I mean, that way you've got those people that are wanting it, if that's how it works.
Well, and I'd have to look, but I don't think you could do a special assessment for something like that, for a beautification project in the central business district or an officer specifically to patrol. But if you were going to reconstruct the sidewalks
Mhm.
through all of the central business districts so that they are ADA compliant in every area of the central business district, that would be a situation where you could do a special assessment that is only a tax on those properties in the central business district. And as Ron said, the benefit of that is that when you have major capital projects like that are only going to benefit a limited segment of town, you can assess those properties that are benefiting directly rather than spreading it across the entire population of the town, all of the tax base. And that's, a question of fiscal priority, and different towns do it differently. It's easier, I think, in Black Mountain to spread it across the entire tax base because we're fairly small.
Well, I go back to
Most-
Ron's comment about making it happen this year.
Yeah.
That probably is not a reasonable thing to keep in mind.
And this has been a trend, as you know, for several years, just ask Ashland or Boone, that the legislature is more inclined to take away local authority than to give. And to get our charter updated, it might be worth this board's having that conversation on a later date, just get the
Right.
charter up to date.
Right. Or, it actually is significant enough, and I think it's really true within the history of our town. It's a significant enough issue that it may be just as well for us to leave it there. If that came up and there's a need, then you just work through a local bill and do it. We've never done it before.
I will say, if we're only updating this every 40 years, then we should do it right, and even if it is. a little bit-
Well, right is a matter of,
Well, right, no, I'm not saying that is right, I'm just saying, if we think that that's something that we might want to do, we should.
Yeah.
continue.
Well, I'm taking it back. I don't think so at this point after the discussion.
You have a lot of factors coming into this. We really need an updated charter. Josh sent me the copy of the one that he just marked up the things that didn't apply anymore, about 3/4 of your old charter. So we're ready. But it's something that I got the indication this board wanted to move forward with at a pretty good clip, especially because of the certain elements you're repairing. And then we have to look at the political reality. If we throw a hot potato in there, then we may not have our charter updated. But special assessments in time as we grow, that's going to be probably a discussion we have again and again. But in the interest of speed right now, And you have to be specific. You can't just say, we're allowed to have special. We've got to put it in. We get do special assessments for streets, special assessments for sidewalks, special assessments for water infrastructure, that kind of thing. You got to identify what you need the special assessment for. And think about it. If we'd had this conversation and updated the charter 15 years ago, would we have wanted to put in that we put in a special assessment for the infrastructure for broadband? We'll never keep up with that horse. But in a lot of the political climate right now, well, I don't call it political, but at least the attitude of the state toward our local governments, and probably just a lack of knowledge of what we will want assessments for that we may not even be able to identify. At this point, worthy of discussion down the road, not recommended for a charter amendment right now.
All right, any other questions for Ron or Anna? So what would be our next step?
You should probably put this on for one of your regular meetings for public comment and a hearing before voting to submit, send this up to the legislature for adoption.
So is the board ready to have this on the agenda at the March meeting? That's next month, isn't it?
Is that enough notice?
You could call for the public hearing at the March meeting.
Yeah, I think
That might be a wise thing to do.
Thank you.
Does that sound agreeable to the board? Put that on the agenda, call a public hearing, and that would take place at the April meeting.
So this copy will be available to the public to see.
It's available now.
Okay.
And when will we vote on changing the name of the board?
Well, that's in the charter. And right now, I'm using council as well, so
She's
we'll-
put it in as town council, perhaps 2 or 3 words that says the governing board shall be known as town council. We might just tweak that in. That might be just a simple way to get it done.
I was thinking of the
I thought it was in there.
Well, it doesn't say.
Oh,
that.
you mean just to
The
set it
reference,
forth?
the reference is
Yeah.
always to town council, but it
Right.
doesn't state that
Right.
directly.
So at the last time we met, I made that motion and then I withdrew it because we needed the public's input.
Yeah.
But you're saying at this point, we don't need to make a motion to change the name?
Well, you've already made the motion, and at this point, you're gonna propose a new charter.
Uh-huh.
And before this can be reposted for the public, it's possible at some point, and Anna can pick that spot, that it would clearly state that henceforth, from the adoption of the charter, the town board, governing body will be known as the town council.
Right, except
can-
that we don't need the approval of the charter to change the name of
No,
this
you can
body.
do that by ordinance.
Right.
So should we vote on that separately in case this doesn't pass through the
Not a bad idea.
General Assembly?
We can, and because we're gathered to talk about this, could they make that motion this morning if they wanted to?
Would you like, if we're gonna do it by ordinance, then it needs to go before the board. It's not our agenda, it's a special call meeting.
Okay,
But if you wanna, and that, I don't think that's something that requires a public hearing, although Savannah's probably got the agenda ready to go and make her work some more. That could be added for the March meeting.
yeah,
Add it to the March one.
sure. Yep, sounds good. Good for everybody?
And you probably want that motion to also direct that that all of the ordinances be updated to change the reference from Board of Aldermen to Town Council.
So yeah, I mean, this is simple, right? You just we make the change on the front end. And on the back end, we've been aldermen since we've been created, so it may take staff about some time to change these names, so.
So what about this? Could you pass it and put wording in there that from this point forward, all references in the documents will reflect the change in nomenclature or whatever of our elected officials? Can you just say going forward? I mean, because that is a lot of stuff for, to a lot of, I mean, it's everything
Good
in the
job for
world.
interns.
Everything in the world, yeah.
I think you probably want the current code to use the phrase Town Council instead of Board of Aldermen. Now, does all your letterhead have to be changed right away and all your business cards and, every reference on the website? I think those things certainly can be done as we come across them. But the ordinances themselves, I think you're probably better served to go ahead and try and get those updated. Now, can you take 90 days to do that or something? Sure.
And that is just a labor intensive task, not particular. Now we have Unicode, it's searchable. It doesn't take long to find every incident, alderman or board in it. But it's gonna be labor intensive to come up with this big long ordinance that references each one, makes the change. But it's not as insurmountable as it would have been 10 years ago.
I think the point is that this body decides what the name will be going forward. And then as time goes on, the changes wherever they happen to be, like right here, those can happen, but nothing can happen until this body decides what the name is going forward.
Make that, yeah.
And the other part, I was all ready to make a motion today. The other part of it I wanted to include was that we would get rid of gender-specific titles for us, and that going forward, we'd be known as council members. So
That could be incorporated in the same ordinance that makes you town
so
council.
when do we do this? At the March meeting?
March, we're looking at the March
Gotcha.
meeting, trying to get it on the agenda.
Okay.
Anybody else? Anybody else on any discussions, anything on point with our meeting this morning? If not, if there's no objections, meeting adjourned.
Pam, if it's any help, in my office, we've already made the change.